About 1 minute, so I'm gonna see if this will.
I figured. Yeah, I figured that out.
No shot.
All right.
I almost wondered.
Which game is it?
So today is one of my favorite lectures, and it's at the end of the class. And I suppose it's kind of at a bad time because it's Thanksgiving week. And so I had a number of students text me and say, "Are we actually having class?" It's like, well, I gave you last class to work on the exam. So yeah, we kind of got material to cover. We kind of got to have class. And today is one of the days where people have the most opportunity to really pick up a lot of points, because I think these are issues that we can talk about in terms of product development that everybody can relate to, because we've all experienced product failures, or we know people who have experienced product failures and have had issues that may have led to tragic results with products that we use every single day. In a highly complex and complicated postmodern world, the ability of the average consumer to understand the implications of many of the products that we use fully is overwhelming if you think about it. And so a lot of the theories that we use, you really have to think about, particularly the ones that are most applicable to product development, how it is that we are going to judge the overall happiness of the population, and how far back or forward do we have to think about in terms of what we want to accomplish as a society, as a group of people, with the resources we have. For the first time in human history, for example, the number of obese people on the planet exceeds the number of starving people on the planet. That's because of advances in food production that have allowed us to really ramp up the quality and quantity, or maybe just the quantity of food that we produce, and to produce lots of things really cheaply and ship them out. Now, whether or not they're actually quality is a good question. So how many of you have seen a movie called Food Inc. or a documentary called Food Inc.? It makes you want to become a vegetarian after you see that movie. Although one of the things that they highlight in that movie that has become really, really problematic for so many people is the fact that corn is found in almost everything. And the varieties of corn that we grow now are really not, they're calorically dense, but not necessarily at all healthy for you. And so we have to think about, how far in advance, what's the reasonable foreseeability that we have with a lot of these kinds of products. So the case that I chose to talk about in this is one I think that highlights the problems that you have in looking at an extremely complex environment and trying to figure out the overall, for example, if you're going to use utilitarian ethics, greatest happiness. And that's what a lot of the theories in law, particularly when we talk about these issues, rely on, is sort of a utilitarian approach to the damage that products may cause. And so one of these products that was highlighted in a previous edition of the case book, and one that I think is really, really profound, involves a drug called diethylstilbestrol, DES. There are a number of conditions that may cause couples who want to have children to have problems with getting pregnant and actually having a child. right? And we're becoming more and more aware of those every single day. And we're coming up with ways of dealing with those situations so that people who want to have children can. And this is a topic that's incredibly timely because when the Trump administration selected, in the first go around of the Trump administration, selected judges who overturned Roe versus Wade, I'm not sure that anybody thought about the implications of that decision for things like in vitro fertilization, IVF. When they harvest ovum in order to do IVF, and this has been an issue that has been litigated in courts for a long time, but nobody directly connected it to the abortion issue until we overturned Roe versus Wade, and all of a sudden you have a problem because the theory on which they overturned Roe versus Wade is that human beings have due process rights, and the question becomes, at what point do you become a human being? And for many, many people in this debate, that point occurs when you have conception. The moment that you have a fertilized ovum, right? That's when a lot of people consider there to be human life. Why is this a problem for IVF? Well, when they harvest ovum in order to engage in vitro fertilization, they don't harvest one. Because it's an invasive surgery and it requires a lot of resources, they generally harvest multiple ovum from the female and then fertilize those. And they keep them in cold storage so that they can be used later, because there are high rates of failure once they implant the ovum in the female, right? And that could be the biological mother or a surrogate. I have several friends who have gone through IVF, and the failure rate is pretty high of the implantation. So if you only harvested one ovum and fertilized it, your success rate could plummet. And as a result, they generally harvest multiple. Now, if you believe that life begins at the moment of conception, what do you do with these once you get a successful pregnancy and you carry it to term? What do you do with the remainder? And is the destruction of those ovum a violation of the idea and the sanctity of human life, the beginnings of a human life? Nobody thought about that when they overturned Roe versus Wade. I don't think the justices really thought about this. I mean, it's hard to know what's in the mind of the justices, but I don't think anybody was really thinking about IVF when this happened, right? And maybe they should have, because there's lots of case law on this. Lots of couples who can't or have a hard time conceiving children and carrying them to term will engage in IVF therapies to deal with this problem. And then during the course of attempting to get pregnant, those marriages end, and the question becomes, what happens to those ovum? Are they destroyed? And you have court cases on this where women are saying, well, those are, I still want to use them, I still want to get pregnant. And you have ex-husbands now saying things like, I don't want you to carry that child. I don't want you to get pregnant with my what will biologically be my child. Why is that? We're divorced. I don't ever want to see you again. Right? Or cases where they donate them to maybe other people. How do you deal with that? You can see that this will be problematic. One of these problems that it becomes very difficult to see in reasonable foreseeability involved this drug called diethylstilbestrol. So there are lots of things that may result in people having a difficult time producing a child. There are women who can't conceive because of a variety of factors. There are men who obviously cannot produce children for a variety of factors. But then there are other conditions in which women can conceive, but what seems to happen to them is they go through a lot of spontaneous abortions, which we call miscarriages, right? And this is really traumatic. I have a sister-in-law who experienced this herself. She had no problem getting pregnant, but she had a lot of difficulty carrying pregnancies to term. So she would get pregnant and then she would miscarry. And if you want children, these are traumatic events for you. If that's what you want, and you want children, when this happens, I can tell you from watching this that this is traumatic. She has now managed to have 2 children, but it has taken an enormous amount of effort to do that. Enter in the 1970s diethylstilbestrol. So for these women who are like my sister-in-law, who have a hard time carrying a pregnancy to term, they found this drug which seemed to stop those women who have this condition where they spontaneously abort or miscarry their fetuses. Now, if you want to have children, and this is a problem for you, you're probably going to take this drug. All drugs have side effects. In fact, almost everything that you put into your body probably has a side effect. Everything that you consume probably has side effects. Some of those side effects are great. Some of them are not so great. Nobody could have reasonably foreseen what would happen with diethylstilbestrol. It turns out that in a large percentage of these women who used this drug in order to be able to carry children to term, years and years later, the female offspring of these women began to develop rare and mostly fatal forms of cancer. And because the cancer is such a rare form, it's not one of these things that is common, like, say, lung cancer or, breast cancer or things like that. They were able to, with reasonable degrees of probability, trace these cancer occurrences back to the fact that these women had taken their mothers, the women whose mothers had taken diethylstilbestrol, that there was a reasonable probability that these rare cancers were linked to that drug. Now, when they determine that the relative probability is high enough that their cancer is caused by a drug that was manufactured by drug companies and sold and marketed, who do you think they're going to sue? Oh, they sue the drug companies. Now, what's wrong with that?
Could it have been,
I think you had your hand up first. Go.
She can go, she's.
Okay, go ahead.
sorry, could it have been like that they couldn't have reasonably foreseen, like you said, that that was gonna happen?
Yes, there is a reasonable foreseeable, you can get a duck. There is a reasonable foreseeableness. Normally what happens when people take drugs is the interactions that occur that are negative with the drug historically have affected the person who ingested the drug. We now know a lot more than we did, and I was born in 1973, for example. We now know a lot more about what happens to people in utero and the impacts that things can happen in utero. There are studies, for example, that are being conducted that nobody would have thought about earlier as a result of our understanding of how much things and hormones can affect women who are pregnant. For example, they're now doing a lot of studies on adoptions. And as a whole, as a group, you cannot apply characteristics of the aggregate to the individual, nor can you extrapolate characteristics of the individual to the aggregate. Those are logical fallacies, right? Adopted children seem to have more adjustment issues than non-adopted children. And one of the reasons that economists and biologists are now hypothesizing and coming up with this is that one of the things that happens when women become pregnant and they don't want the pregnancy, it's not a wanted pregnancy, is they produce huge amounts of cortisol. And that cortisol can cross the placenta. There are two hormones that we exhibit when we deal with stress. And cortisol is one of them. The other is testosterone. Some people who are required, for example, to step into leadership roles when something tragic happens, who are not natural leaders, a lot of times their testosterone will increase or their cortisol will increase, one or the other. And it's usually an opposite effect. So there are these studies that suggest that one of the things that may be implicated in unwanted pregnancies is huge levels of cortisol. And it's impacting fetal development. In the 1970s, they didn't really understand a lot of this. It was the early years. I mean, we now know, for example, and they tell you there are warning labels, and they put them in bars in females' restrooms that say things like drinking alcoholic beverages while pregnant may lead to fetal abnormalities, right? In the 1960s and 70s and 50s, 60s and 70s, women smoked when they were pregnant and they drank. And we now know that maybe you shouldn't do that. So yes, there is this foreseeability issue because normally we now know, now in 2024, it seems like a no-brainer that, yeah, if you take drugs, I mean, women who become pregnant really, I mean, and doctors, when they start going for neonatal visits, really start to monitor or suggest what you should do to maintain a healthy pregnancy, right? There are neonatal vitamins that they recommend and all of these things. So this seems like, but in 1970, they didn't understand a lot of this. What's a second problem beyond the foreseeability that occurred in the 1970s? We now we would say, yeah, duh, like you take a drug. And there are lots of drugs they will not give women who are pregnant. You know, I mean, they create lots of issues, right? You probably shouldn't be taking Oxy, for example, while you're pregnant. You know, little things. Did you have something else that you wanted?
That is what I was gonna say.
Reasonable foreseeability. What else? In suing the drug manufacturer, what you are in essence saying is, I should never have been born. How do you measure that? How do you measure happiness or pain? Is it better to never have been born? Is it better to have lived? And even though your life is cut short, is it better to have had some life than no life?
Could you be suing for like emotional distress? Like if
I
you-
guess you could, but I mean, life is stressful. Intentional infliction of emotional distress is a very high bar, right? Sure, it's very stressful. But we don't let people sue for that, right? Unless it's an intention and outrageous conduct by the defendant.
Were they saying that the drug for certain? Like, was there like some sort of?
Well, there's no absolute certainties in product liability, right? We deal with probabilities. And we deal with probabilities in criminal law. We don't say that people are guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? There will always be a shadow of a doubt. We say that you are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And we find people who are on death row every year who have been wrongly convicted on that standard, beyond a reasonable doubt. We make mistakes all the time in the law, and we just have to live. It's not perfect. Juries are not perfect. So we say it's beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil matters, we don't use beyond a reasonable doubt as the standard. We use what's called a preponderance of the evidence standard. So what you're saying in a preponderance of the evidence standard is that the actions of the defendant, more likely than not, caused the harm that you are seeking to redress. What is more likely than not? It's generally 50% plus something. And the standard that they give you, so what you have to think about, I hate this analogy, but it's the one that courts use all the time. In a preponderance of the evidence, they'll say it's 50% plus a feather. So if you think of Justice, which is the goddess Thebius, holding the scales, she's blindfolded, a sword in one hand, the scales of justice in another, you have an equally balanced scale. And what you're saying is that if you applied a feather to either side of that balance, that it would tip one way or another. 50% plus a feather. That's the standard. So you're saying it's more likely than not. And how do we determine that? Well, we determine it through statistical probability. All of these women developed sort of the same rare cancer. It's like in the early days of HIV, which they didn't call HIV, they called it GRID in the early days, gay-related immune deficiency syndrome. They didn't know a lot about it, but one of the things that they knew was A, that it affected homosexuals more than it was affecting heterosexuals, and B, they were developing rare forms of cancer. And it was a form of cancer that had, up until that point, was only seen in a very small subset of the population of Ashkenazi Jews. And all of a sudden, these gay men around the world started developing this rare form of cancer, which is, I can't ever pronounce it correctly, but the closest I can come is Kaposi sarcoma, which is, it's a purple skin cancer that develops in the later stages. You almost see nobody with these anymore because HIV and AIDS is controllable, right? It's not a death sentence the way it was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So how do you measure this? What these women are saying is basically, I shouldn't have been born. Because without the drug, they probably wouldn't have been born. And it didn't affect the male offspring of these women who took the drug, as I understand it. So how do you measure overall happiness? I would say probably, in my calculation, the drug companies manufacturing the drug created more happiness than pain, although there was some life is better than no life. Most people want to live. Very few people take their own lives. This is highlighted by Voltaire in a book called Candide. I think I've talked about it before. They get together with this old woman in this book, and they're comparing tragedies. And at the end of their comparing of tragedies, the woman says, but I've only known as wretched as my life became, I've only known a handful of people who have taken their own lives. And she lists them. Most people want life. And surely over the course of that life, they experienced joy and sorrow. I would venture to guess that women who had the means to take this drug probably provided, and had the desire, probably provided fairly decent childhoods for most of those individuals. How do you measure overall happiness? So what could you possibly use as a theory to punish the drug company for something that at that point in time was not, obviously now we know that, which is why there are warning labels on drugs about if you are pregnant, are going to become pregnant, do not take this drug. Or consult your physician before you do and weigh the risks and benefits. I mean, it may be that you have to take the drug. Obviously, if you're young and you develop breast cancer, you're probably going to take the treatment for breast cancer. And could that affect either current or later fetal development? Absolutely. But you have to know, you have to weigh those risks, right, in advance. The second issue that we'll talk about is prescription drug costs. Who should bear the cost? And that's a pricing issue. So if we go back in time and we think about issues of product safety, we dealt with this from a legal standpoint. And at the beginning of the class, I told you that a lot of people who write in the field of business ethics or marketing ethics say that the law is an acceptable moral minimum. And I told you that's just not true. I've seen it in lots of academic papers that they say this, that the law is an acceptable moral minimum. That's absolutely not true because the law itself may be immoral. So we have the law and we have ethics, and where they overlap, we have an area of concurrent issues that we have to address, right? The law itself may be immoral, and if it is, most of us would argue that you have no ethical duty to follow the law. The classic example of this is after the Civil War. Millions of people who had formerly been enslaved were now subject to second-class citizenship standards through a doctrine that was established in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which created the doctrine of separate but equal. So a lot of these formerly enslaved people, once the Reconstruction era in the South ended, began to sue as the South came up with ways of discriminating against formerly enslaved people and their descendants through an aggressive series of laws that separated on the basis of race, which is really a miscarriage of justice in so many ways, because there really is only one race. There is the human race, right? And there are different ethnicities within that, but race is not a terribly compelling or appropriate category. But the law said, we created these arbitrary categories in the law, and we said these people can be segregated from these people without violating the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution, so long as you had separate but equal facilities. Now, they were never equal, right? And that's one of the things that they proved in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that these facilities were never equal. And so it was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. But we had this whole doctrine of separate but equal. In that instance, the law itself was immoral. And most of us would argue that those people who engaged in freedom rides and engaged in civil disobedience like sit-ins at lunch counters were perfectly within the moral, high ground to engage in that behavior. Having said that, the law is important. It's an important consideration. And one of the things that we consider in the law and things like product safety is how do we evaluate product safety issues when almost no product today is perfectly safe. as innocuous as you think these products that you are using in here, these laptops are, we now know that they're highly addictive. They now recommend that you don't give electronic devices to small children because it can lead to social isolation and environmental factors that can lead to negative consequences down the road. You wouldn't think that a computer would be dangerous on average, right? But they are. Can't tell you how many times I always set, oh, it's not set to vibrate, could go off, I should do that. I always set my phone to vibrate most of the time because in class, I think it's rude if your phone is going off. And so I generally kind of leave it on vibrate so that you're not in public annoying people with your loud ringtones and things like that. How many of you have experienced phantom vibrations? It happens to me all the time. Where you think your phone is vibrating and it's not. I've had phantom vibrations in my back pocket when I didn't have my phone. And I start grabbing for my phone. I usually carry my wallet in one back pocket and I stick my phone in the other when I'm walking someplace. And I've not had the phone and have had phantom vibrations. That's addiction, isn't it? How many hours a day? I mean, they now tell you as part of this product safety, your iPhones tell you how many hours a week on average you spent each day on this device. And it's a shocking amount, isn't it? That's addiction. How many of you go crazy when you don't have this device? I mean, literally start to have withdrawal from the device. Years and years and years ago, my friends and I started this when cell phones really became very popular and everybody, and the smartphones became very popular and everybody had them. We started doing this. We started insisting we would have movie night on Wednesday nights, either at my house or my friend Robert's house. And we would invite a group of friends. We were the only two in the group that cooked because nobody cooks anymore, right? Everybody goes out to eat most meals. And so we actually, the two of us were actually fairly good cooks. I've cooked for a living. I've been a chef for a living. I still earn part of my living doing that. And so we would go to either my house or his house, and there was a group of us that would come. And we started insisting because we would eat dinner and watch a movie as a group. And what you would notice is that as we were eating dinner, people are engaging in doing this. They're looking on their phone. Somebody would say something, and people, how many of you do this? The minute somebody says something and you don't believe what they're saying, you start to Google it. You grab your phone and you start to Google. And so we started noticing this. So we came up with a rule, which is when we were having dinner on Wednesday nights, you either left your phone in the car or we had a basket. You turned it on silent and we had a basket. And there were people who stopped coming to dinner over this. And this was 15 years ago or more. And then they came back and they started realizing, and it's okay as long as you don't have the device on you. I went to a restaurant recently with my brother and his now wife. I just married them. And I was the officiant at their wedding 2 weekends ago in Plano, Texas. And his girlfriend at the time, now wife, her father is the largest importer of Italian wines in the United States. And so he came to Fort Worth to meet with clients. And one of the clients has a restaurant in the Stockyards, the Fort Worth Stockyards district, which is a really fun entertainment district to go to. And it's a really, really nice restaurant. And so they wanted us to give up our phones, which I had no problem doing that. So what their thing is, we want you to enjoy the food and not be on your phones. But they didn't take the phone away from us. They gave us our phones in these little bags that you had to have a an RFID like you use for your key cards at hotels, an RFID key to open the bag. And they gave us the phones back. And literally, so my brother knew this, and he left his phone at the hotel, and they practically searched him because they're like, sir, you've got to give up your phone. You got to give us your phone so we can put it in this bag. Now, the thing that really bothered me about it was I was like, this is a great idea. We did, my friends and I did this years ago. When we would have dinner on Wednesday nights, we would always put our phones in this basket or tell everybody to leave them in the car. And, that's a great idea. But they gave us the bag back. If they had kept, so now my phone is going off. I can feel it through this bag. My phone, and I am like going crazy. As long as I don't have the phone, I can sort of deal with it. But if I feel it going off, it makes me insane. That's addiction, isn't it? Isn't that as addictive as, I don't know, smoking? I quit smoking 20 years ago. I can tell you, like, if you're a smoker, you got to have a cigarette. And it's hard to go without it. When I was in college, you could smoke in the buildings. Here, at OU and here. I went to OU and here. And you could smoke in the buildings. When I was in college, professors could smoke in the classrooms. And when they banned smoking from the buildings, I mean, it was a big deal. People like started having, when they told professors they couldn't smoke in their offices, that was a huge, I remember, I was associate general counsel when we came up with that rule. And we had one professor who kept smoking in her office and kept insisting that the smell that her colleagues smelled when they would turn her in was her candle. I can't believe you're bugging me about my candle. I'm like, I know what cigarette smells. I'd go over there. I know what cigarettes. She's like, no, it's my candle. Odd how that candle smelled. These are really hard things to train yourself out of. Now smokers have gotten used to not being able. You can't smoke anywhere on campus, right? You can't even smoke in your car because it's gotten, as we've gotten more and more knowledge about the effects of secondhand smoke, we've moved it further and further out. It used to be that you could smoke right outside the door. So what would happen? Well, you'd have all these people that were non-smokers that were forced to walk through what was a cloud of smoke at every building entrance every time we had classes let in, or between classes going in or out. There would be a crowd of people outside the door, huddled together, smoking. Now, if you want to smoke, you have to get in your car and go across the street off campus to smoke. So, I mean, these are really, really hard issues to deal with. So we start out in the law, and of course this focuses on its spillover into ethics. How do we evaluate and compensate people when we have these issues? Well, for most of human history, the theory at Anglo-American jurisprudence was something called caveat emptor. And caveat emptor literally means let the buyer beware. Now, for most of human history, most people could evaluate the quality of the good and service that they were purchasing. For most of human history, how did people get around? It wasn't by automobile. For most of human history, the way people got around was by horse or carriage or some other beast of burden that was available to them, or they walked if they didn't have it, right? The horse was extinct from the Americas for many, many, many years. It was reintroduced here in the United States by the Europeans, but they had, oxen and things like that, or other ways, or they just walked. you could evaluate in the olden days the safety or the quality of a horse. Anybody who grew up in that time period, I would suggest to you, knew how to sort of look at a horse and you could say, that one's sway backed, that one's got problems with its hooves. And you also knew what the risks were in riding a horse. Pretty obvious. They have minds of their own, don't they? They're a living, sentient creature. And so you knew when you got on it, you know, and you could inspect how do people ride horses well with a saddle and some kind of device to control the horse to make it go or go right or left. That's usually a bridle, which is a bit that goes in the horse's mouth, right? And then you train the horse to, when you pull on the rein, it pulls on their mouth and they go right. If you pull on the left, they go left. If you pull back on both, they stop. I shouldn't have to explain this, but you know, since in the last 10 years, since I've been teaching this course, I've taught the course for over 20 years now, but since I've been teaching in the last 10 years, there are lots of people who have never been on a horse now. When I started teaching this class, I would ask how many of you grew up or knew somebody, you know, in your family that was a farmer, and almost everybody had some experience. Now I've got lots of students who have never been on a horse, never been horseback riding. It's hard to do. There used to be riding stables all over Oklahoma where you could go. There were riding stables at Lake Overholser. There were riding stables at Lake Thunderbird. They're all gone. Now nobody does that anymore. Summer camps, that was a big thing, big activity. Almost all summer camps, they had riding lessons for people. So most people had some experience with a horse. Now I have lots of students. How many of you have ridden a horse in here? Okay. How many of you have not ridden a horse? 2, 4. All right. It's unusual. Last semester I asked this question and nobody raised their hand. Nobody had been on a horse. So it's pretty easy to evaluate. As we get into the Industrial Revolution, the law changes because it becomes more difficult to evaluate whether or not a product is safe. So again, you could look at your products and you knew, you know, that the horse was either sway backed, it was going to have problems with its feet, things like that. Once you get into cars and automobiles, well, in the early days, it was still pretty easy to evaluate. The car had a big advantage over the horse in that you didn't have to clean up after it. It didn't die unexpectedly or have a mind of its own. That seems safer, doesn't it? And in the early days, it was. The Ford Model T, which was the first mass-produced automobile. Automobiles have been around long before Henry Ford, you know, mass-produced the Model T. But that was the first car that was available to the average person. And it was pretty simplistic. You had a combustion engine, steering wheel, and brakes. Not difficult to figure out. And it had lots of advantages over horses because today it's a fairly pleasant day to ride your horse to UCO for college, if that's how you get here. But yesterday, would it have been a pleasant day? Not really. It was windy and cold. And that's just the beginning. It could be even worse than that, rainy. You know, so you've got this car that comes along and it's now, you know, better than the horse. And we can still sort of safely evaluate that. So we don't really get a movement away from let the buyer beware to negligence until we get to the Industrial Revolution, the real busy part of the Industrial Revolution. And now we're now creating products that people can't evaluate as easily. They're having more and more issues. And as more and more people move from the country and an agricultural rule-based society to one in which we have a lot of people living in closely confined spaces, the number of things increases and the ways that you can hurt yourself increase, and it may not be readily apparent. So again, you see a series of cases in the law dealing with this. In the first part of the Industrial Revolution, I think I've sort of talked about this before in a class in here, we had people moving to the cities. How did they get these goods? So Fords are manufactured largely in Michigan. Did people have to go to Michigan to buy them? No. Well, they put them on transport and they transported them. How do we transport lots of automobiles? to this day across country by car, by rail car, freight car, right? Or on, on a ship. 90% of everything that we use comes to us by shipping in some form or fashion, even though we're here in Oklahoma and we don't think of shipping as being a major player. We, by the way, have the furthest western and northern port in the United States west of the Mississippi until you get to California. Where is that? It's right here in Oklahoma.
Up in Tulsa.
It's the port of Catoosa, right? That's the furthest northern and western. Now, there are further north, but not west. So we bring a lot of goods up through the port of Catoosa or the port of Muskogee on the McClellan-Kerr waterway. It's amazing how many things are shipped in and how many things are shipped out. A lot of our agricultural products, we're big producers of wheat, are shipped out of those ports, tons and tons and tons a year, right? So they shipped a lot of goods by rail car. How did you get the rail cars from one place to another? Well, you have a steam locomotive engine. In the early days of the steam locomotive engine, they only went one way, forward. So when they got to the end of the line, what did they do? Well, they put them on this device, right? And along with caveat emptor, we had a theory in the law called trespassers are owed no duty. And so if you trespassed on somebody's property in the olden days, the law was you were a dirty dog tortfeasor and we owed you no duty. If you got injured on somebody's property, they owed you no duty. Well, we now start to see people come to these cities. They don't just abandon the locomotive when it gets to the end of the line. I think I've talked about this before. They put it on a turntable and they turn it around and send it back down the tracks the opposite direction. You can still see these to this day in San Francisco. They have turntables for the streetcars. They'll get to a stopping point. The conductor of the streetcar will jump out. He has a key that he puts into the turntable, which is in the street, and that turns the streetcar around and heads it back and down another track when they get to a stopping place, right? These are interesting to children. They're dangerous. It's not automatically apparent to most people that this would be dangerous. Their kids are playing on them. And what happens? Well, they start to lose fingers because these are pieces of heavy machinery that young people can't evaluate the danger. And so they're losing limbs on these turntables. And the law begins to change through a series of cases called the railroad turntable cases, where you start to see the law say, look, if you bring a dangerous item onto your property and it is attractive to children and you can reasonably control that area cheaply, what do? How do you stop? Well, you lock the turntable. Why do they have a key for the streetcar in San Francisco? Well, it's to keep people from getting on the turntable, which to a child would probably look like something that you all don't remember, but I remember from my childhood called a merry-go-round that they had on these playgrounds, and they were awful. I mean, like the playgrounds in my school, literally killing fields. First of all, the playground was asphalt, not exactly a, great surface. And we had this merry-go-round thing. And you'd get on it with your friends, and one person would run around and try to get it going really, really fast to see what would happen. How long you could, it's a centrifuge, how long you could stay on, hold on in various positions, right? And you would go flying off, or somebody would jump off onto asphalt. We don't put these on playgrounds anymore. Why? They're dangerous.
They're fun.
They are fun, but there's lots of things that are dangerous that we still put on playgrounds. So anything that goes up that you can climb on is probably dangerous, which is why we slap warning labels on all of that says fall risk. Don't leave your children unsupervised on the playground. Swings. This was a big deal when I was a kid. Again, we had a swing set on the playground in my school that was on asphalt. And what do kids do? Well, you get going as high as you can. And then in order to get the sensation of flying, you jump off. That's like great for breaking legs and other things, twisting ankles, breaking ankles, having traumatic head injuries. So these turntables look like merry-go-rounds to these kids, and the law begins to change slowly. At about the same time that we get this idea of negligence in products, we also get this idea that in property rights, the trespassers are owed no duty begins to give way to well, if you bring an inherently dangerous object onto your property, you know that it's inherently dangerous. You've had warning because kids are on there playing and at these rail yards. The attendants, the conductors and engineers and other agents of the railway had chased children off of these devices many, many times. So it's known, it's apparent to you, it's notorious, it's dangerous, and it's not going to cost you a lot of money to do what? You put a lock on it so that when it's not being used by the railroad, and you can lock these devices, right? They do them in San Francisco for the streetcars still. The device requires this thing that you have to have. We're going to start to owe a duty. Well, the same thing happens in products liability. So if we go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if you go back and Cher sings a song about this, right? By the way, Cher is a fantastic artist. She's the only artist to have had a top 10 hit in her teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's pretty impressive. One of her top hits was an old song called Gypsies, Tramps, and Thieves. And in that, she talks about her family, which are, I guess gypsies. That's a pejorative term now. I think they prefer to be called travelers. And, her father would put on a traveling show and he'd sell doctors a feel good. Well, all kinds of people used to do this. They used to travel around the country. And again, for most of human history, the theory was if you were stupid enough to buy this stuff and take it, and the Dr. Feelgood could cure everything from cancer to baldness, right? They would say, and usually what was this product it was usually like some kind of moonshine that was probably going to kill you if you took enough of it. And the idea was if you were stupid enough to buy it, well, then we get into the Industrial Revolution. Medicine makes lots of advances, right? Again, we've had a couple of presidents that have been shot and some that have managed to live beyond the shooting. I think the evidence suggests that Lincoln was probably dead at the theater before the doctors arrived to him, but there's at least one president who was shot and died days later because the doctors got there and they started poking around with their fingers in the wound for the bullet, leading to infections that spread throughout the body, and then he died. And so, we make advances in medicine, and now we have people that are marketing drugs, and so we start to regulate. As people begin to move to the cities, we start to see a move away from trespassers are owed no duty to trespassers may be owed a duty if you bring something that's notorious and dangerous and open and apparent and you know it onto your property and you do nothing to control it, well, you're going to be found liable. What's another example of this? What is the product of trespassers may be owed a duty? Well, if you have a swimming pool now and you own a swimming pool in a city limits, if you're out in the country, you may not have to put a fence up. It depends on whether or not your county has zoning ordinances and things like that. In Oklahoma, we generally don't. And as I fly back and forth from McKinney to see my brother and Oklahoma City, I notice as I go across, there's lots of pools out in the country and they, these people don't have any fences around them. But if you do it in a city, what, like out in the country, you're out miles away from people, probably if somebody comes and falls in your pool and they drown, you're going to be held liable. And you're certainly going to be held liable in a city. So this doctrine of trespassers may be owed a duty now starts to apply to other things besides railroad turntables, swimming pools. It's what is called the attractive nuisance doctrine, right? Swimming pools. Kids love water, particularly in Oklahoma in the summer. Why? It's hot. And so if you have a swimming pool, people used to just put swimming pools up in their backyard, no fence around it. And of course, neighbor kids would sneak in and get in the pool, and then they drowned. And under the old rule, that was too bad for the kid and the parents. The new rule is, as a result of these turntable cases, we start to apply this to other things. It's open, it's notorious, you know the children are attracted to it. Well, how far do we extend that then? On Saturday, I'm going to the Sarah Brightman concert in Kansas City. Kansas City is known for its fountains. I think outside of Rome, it has it's in the United States, the largest amount of fountains. And in the world, outside of Rome, it's the largest number. Should we have like things, it looks like a pool, isn't it? When I was married years and years ago, I started debating this with my wife, Robin. It's pool-like. She's like, no, we shouldn't lock up the fountains. I was going through law school at the time. She's like, it's not a pool. It's deep. You could swim in it. Kids do. Ever seen kids around a fountain in New York City, Kansas City? They're gonna get in it. Should we hold the fountain owners liable if somebody drowns in the fountain? What do you have to do for a swimming pool? Well, you have to put a fence up. And it's now mandated what that fence has to be. In most cities now, according to the building codes, it's not just, you can't just put up a chain link fence. It's 4 feet high. Because what? Kids can see the pool and they can climb over the fence. So then it started to be, you had to put up a fence that was 6 feet high. Now, in most cities, it's that you have to have some kind of privacy fence and it has to be over 7 feet high. That adds a lot of expense to the pool, doesn't it? Fencing is expensive. So we go from this no duty to some duty, and in products, the some duty we come up with, and it's called the doctrine of negligence. Now, this is purely a utilitarian theory. It's purely utilitarian. Even though it has the word duty in it, right? It's not a duty ethics theory. It's a purely utilitarian theory. So the doctrine of negligence, we go from caveat emptor to this doctrine of negligence. And what does the doctrine of negligence say? Well, if you produce a good or product, you have a duty to manufacture that good in a reasonably safe manner. What does that mean? That the good is safe for its ordinary use and customary use. Well, let's think about something as simple as this chair. What should I have to do if I'm going to manufacture this chair? And I would be willing to bet that if we pick the chair up, oh no, it's still here. Here's the warning labels. Stupid lawyers. They put all kinds of warning labels on the chair. What should this be? What would make this chair safe? This is an inherently dangerous object, by the way. Look at this. Look, it's inherently dangerous. Why? It's got wheels. So it should be reasonably safe for the ordinary use, which is to what? Sit. Yes.
It becomes dangerous if you stand on it.
Oh, yeah. How many of you have used chairs to stand on? I did it today. Inherently dangerous, right? The camera's not working. It's not following me around the room. I tested it. So I got on a chair, the one that you're sitting in, and I stood, and this is inherently dangerous. Look, it moves. Like it could have like slid right out from under me. And I adjusted the camera. I probably shouldn't say this. The administration's gonna be over here. They're gonna watch my video and they're gonna be over here, the safety office giving me, some reprimand about what should I have done? I should have put in a work order and waited for somebody to come and fix the camera. But I took it upon myself so that I'm not lecturing and it's taking a video of the door. So it's picking up what I'm saying and all the visual that you see is the door. So we have warning labels that say things like, because we know now that people use chairs as what? Step stools, that you shouldn't do that. And if you do that, well, you've assumed the risk. And the manufacturer of the chair is not going to be liable for it, maybe, under a negligence theory. So you have a duty to make the product reasonably safe for the ordinary use to which it should be put, which is what? To sit in. And it's reasonably safe, right? If you go back and you look at chairs from the Victorian, I own a bed and breakfast in Guthrie, Oklahoma. We have stopped buying, actually, we used to buy all antique furniture for the bed and breakfast. But as, again, at the beginning of class, I told you that for the first time in human history, the number of obese people in the world now exceeds the number of starving people in the world. And as we have gotten larger, I can no longer, I still buy Victorian furniture for things like dressers and armoires and tables. Although even tables is kind of iffy now because people are, again, heavy. And what do people do on tables? They lean on them or sit on them. And Victorian furniture, like, I would buy these Victorian chairs and you would have somebody who is good Oklahoma, beef-fed farm boy sit on the chair and what would happen? The legs would come. So like this chair, it's obvious, like it's going to support probably a lot of weight. I would venture to guess that in the ordinary course now, it's not unusual to have people that weigh 250, 275, right? And it's going to hold them and support them and not break under the weight in the ordinary course of its usage. It can probably withstand a lot more weight than that. I'm going to guess. Why? Because it's made out of not Victorian chairs were all made out of what? Small wood frames. This is made out of some kind of metal and enforced plastic composite material that will withstand a lot. It'll withstand going back and forth. Whereas people do this. I did it when I was a kid. Lots of chairs didn't lean back. So what would you do? You just rock back on the chair. And how many of you have inevitably felt tipped over? So there's now warning labels on the chair that say things like, don't tip back in the chair, right? Because that's not what it's meant for. It's meant for sitting, not tipping back. Although this one does, has a nice spring to it, right? So you have a duty to manufacture this in a reasonably safe manner. Then if you breach that duty, well, what would lead to a breach of the duty? Manufacturing something that is not, up to the quality and craftsmanship that it should be for the ordinary course in which it is going to be used. So if this chair, for example, if I weigh, I think the last time I weighed right at 200 pounds, which is sort of like incredible because when I got married, I weighed 149 pounds. So, and I'd like to go back to those days, but that's probably not going to happen. So I weigh 200 pounds. I'm sitting in the chair. It's withholding. Now, it may be that they mismanufactured it in the breach of their duty. They didn't make it so that these composite parts were strong enough for a 200-pound individual to sit safely in the chair. That's going to be a breach of the duty. The breach then causes injury and you have causation, which is both cause in fact, which is usually determined by what we call the but-for test, and legal causation. So we have but for, is one test, and then we have proximate cause, right? So generally causation, you have to say but for the negligence. So let's suppose that this chair was manufactured with a material that was inferior in strength. We know that the average person in the United States, let's see what the average weight, just out of curiosity, I'm gonna be addicted to my phone and we'll Google this. Men in, let's see if it comes up with the answer. I'm sure it will. Oh, I'm statistically average. The average weight, recent data from the Centers of Disease Control, this is according to the CDC's website, the average weight of men in the US is 199.8 pounds. So like I am almost exactly, because I think I weigh right at 200. So I think that, 0.2 pounds is probably not one standard deviation away from the average. So I'm like statistically average. I've been statistically average most of my life. The average height forever and ever for men in the United States was something like 5'11". It's now shrunk slightly as a result of demographic changes in the United States. We were getting taller, but as a result of immigration from various places where the average heights are shorter than they are among, sort of Northern European males or descendants of Northern European males, the average height I think is now like 5'9". So I'm statistically above average. I'm 5'11". So, but forever and ever I was statistically I was like average. So I'm the average weight. So this is made, let's suppose that they manufactured it out of some kind of metal. I'm gonna guess that the frame here is probably aluminum, is what I'm gonna guess. So aluminum's enormously strong, but let's suppose they didn't manufacture it within the correct amount of thickness for the aluminum tubing to be able to withstand the average weight of a male in the United States, because statistically we have about roughly the same number of males to females. There's actually slightly more females than there are men in the United States for a variety of reasons, although that number is decreasing as women have increased in the workforce because they're now the #1 killer of women. For years and years and years, it was not the #1 killer of women, but now the #1 killer of women is heart disease. Why is that? Because they're engaging in the same stressful activities that men are engaging in. So they're catching up, but historically speaking, women outlived men. And so there were slightly more women than there were men. And why is that? Well, because up until recently, women were excluded from combat roles in the military. We have fought a continuous war since World War II. And there have been so there are slightly more women than there are men. They tend to outlive us. That's now changing. But the average male is according to the Center for Disease Control, 199.8 pounds. So I'm like, so it should be fine. And I'm gonna say that it probably, but let's suppose they made the tubing just a little bit too thin. And so it collapses, or you have a high number of failures of the structural integrity of the chair. Well, that would be a breach of the duty. Now, if I'm not injured by it, let's suppose I sit on it every day and it doesn't do anything to me, even though they've breached their duty because they have not manufactured it in a reasonably foreseeable, safe way, no injury has been had. But let's suppose that they manufacture it so that it's only really going to support the weight of the average male from 1970. I don't know what the average weight was. I'm going to guess back then it was probably about 150, because people were smaller, engaged in more physical activity, lots of things that have led to that. So let's suppose that, and they start breaking. Well, you're going to have people falling and having injuries. What kind of injuries could result if this chair collapses under my weight? Well, get a head injury. That's one. That could be bad. We now know that traumatic head injuries, concussions, lead to all kinds of results later on in life that we never thought about.
So like, you said that you used to buy a bunch of like Victorian furniture for
Uh-huh.
your friend Becca, or like, who would have the liability there if it's,
Well, that's an interesting, because like, the manufacturer's gone,
yeah,
long gone from those places, right? And how do you determine? Well, you're going to determine liability in that instance by the person who probably owns the chair currently and offered it to the individual. And when we get to strict products liability, what you see is that everybody in the chain is equally liable for the product. But yeah, what do you do when a manufacturer goes out of, like, the manufacturer of this chair could have gone out of business? Who has liability then? What do you do? Who do you sue? Well, the law provides for that when we get to strict products liability. That's a good question. You can have a duck. Somebody else do you have a question or,
I was just gonna expand on injuries.
okay, what else could you have besides a traumatic head injury from falling?
Well, if the metal was thin and snaps at a sharp angle, it could go into you.
Yep, that's a possible injury. You can have duck. That's something that could happen. You could, like have the steel tubing, or not steel tubing, the aluminum tubing cause, when it snaps, a flesh wound of some kind that could get infected. So you have injury. So we have but for the negligence of the manufacturer, I would not have been injured if this happened. So I sit in the chair, something happens, it breaks under my weight, and I am injured by a traumatic head injury because I fall back and I hit the ledge of the whiteboard, let's say, and a piece of sharp metal snaps and hits me in the arm, and so I'm injured there. So we've got but for. Well, if you do this though far enough back, if it's too attenuated, a but for test, usually but for works. But for the negligence of the manufacturing of this product not designed to withhold the average weight of a male in the United States, which is 199.88 pounds, right? I would not have been injured. The proximate cause comes in this idea of reasonably foreseeable, and this is something that we have to think about with diethylstilbestrol. So the seminal case in proximate cause that you learn in law school is called the Falls Graph Railroad case, and I will stop there after I tell you about the case because I'm running out of time, but I'll tell you about it briefly. So there's a man who's carrying a package in a railroad terminal in I think it's the Long Island railroad station, as I recall. I may be wrong on that, but he's carrying a package under his arm. He's getting on a train that's about to depart, and the conductor gives him a little push. He's literally leaping on this train that is about to depart from the station. He drops the package that he's carrying from under his arm as a result of the little shove that the conductor gives him, and that package is containing explosives which explode, and the shock waves from the explosion cause a set of scales at the opposite end of the platform to fall down off the wall and hit this woman named Fallsgraf on the head. Now, who does she sue? Well, you're going to sue the person who has the deepest pockets, right? That's who you're going to sue. Who's got the deepest pockets? It's the railroad. And under a but-for theory of negligence, she would win. But for the act of the railroad employee who shoved this individual onto the platform, causing him to lose his balance and drop the package, she would not have been injured. And the court says that's too attenuated. That's not reasonably foreseen. Who would foresee that? It's really hard to see who would reasonably foresee that. Like, that's a crazy fact pattern, isn't it? Absolutely insane fact pattern. Nobody would reasonably foresee that. But for the action of the defendants, their agent, she wouldn't have been injured. Right? But for the shove, he might not have dropped, or maybe he would have dropped not only the package, but himself, and everything would have exploded. That's proximate cause. So we have to have something that's close enough in temporal terms to be responsible for the injury. I will have to stop there because I'm out of time. Well, I have 1 minute left. If you got ducks, come see me so that I can give you credit. I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving break.
Thank you, you too.